I'm Madison, 52 years old. I live with my husband Robert, who is 59, and our college-age daughter, Abigail. I work for a life insurance company. Robert, my husband, seems to have become more irritable with age. His attitude towards store clerks and his foul language while driving are especially bad. If a motorized bicycle takes too long to make a right turn, he rolls down the window and yells, "Turn already!" blasting the horn. If the cashier at the supermarket forgets to include a fork with our deli purchase, he screams, "You expect me to eat this with my hands?" It's become quite a spectacle. Because of his constant yelling, our daughter doesn't want to go out with him anymore. "I don't want to go out with Dad anymore," she concluded. When Abigail started avoiding him, he got angry at me. "Why is Abigail acting like this towards me? Is she suddenly in her rebellious phase? It must be your fault for how you raised her." When I tried to speak up for our daughter, "It's because you yell at strangers over trivial things that she's avoiding you," he only got angrier. "Who's in the wrong here? It's them, obviously." Making things worse. Who's really in their rebellious phase? Or is this his terrible twos, just 50 years late? It's just unbearable. When I asked him, "Do you ever think that none of these are worth getting angry over? And that you're just ruining the mood?" I asked. "It's ridiculous to think that makes the mood bad. That's something Abigail needs to fix," he replied. I'm starting to feel like I can't keep up. But it seems he's not amused by my attempts to smooth things over anymore, as he starts lashing out at both me and our daughter. If we run out of toothpaste, he'll throw a tissue box, or if his dress shirt isn't ready in the morning, he'll throw an orange. At this point, it's just too much. Mom and I have become his targets for venting. My daughter finally exploded in frustration. I can almost hear it, a faint sound behind my eardrums. The sound of our family breaking apart. Mom comes home tired from work, too. And to get yelled at just because there's no toothpaste, and then to have things thrown at us, it's just too much. It's not about whether an orange or tissues can hurt us. It's not the point. Why can't he prepare his own things? It's like walking into a minefield, never knowing when you'll step on a mine. So my daughter increasingly began to avoid my husband. This only made him more aggressive. "Why is Abigail's attitude towards me so bad?" He kicked the bathroom sink, trying to intimidate me. Toothbrushes clattered to the floor from the kicked sink. At this point, I started to think that I must somehow save my daughter, if not myself, from my husband's unreasonable tyranny. Winter came, and although I had been vaccinated, my job with the life insurance company mostly involves field work, so I inevitably caught the flu and was bedridden. I had a high fever, but the timing was terrible. John, my father-in-law, had planned an overseas trip for his 80th birthday celebration, and it was supposed to be me, my husband John, and my mother-in-law Mary. Given the season, it could have been a contagious disease, but it was just the flu. "Such things will heal during the trip abroad. Just come along. The plane tickets and hotel reservations are already made," my husband commanded. However, I can't go because the flu is contagious, and I don't want to spread it. I had no choice but to refuse. I would not only be a nuisance to my in-laws, but to everyone on the plane and at the destination. But my husband was in the midst of his terrible twos. "What the hell? Why do you have to get sick today of all days? We've been planning this for a long time." He slammed the table. "There's nothing I can do about it." "Your self-care is just pathetic. I have to do all the preparations by myself now. Are you kidding me?" He started preparing alone, yelling and shouting. He noisily opened and closed the suitcase to start packing. The next morning, I was awakened by my husband's yelling. It was only 4 a.m. He had stayed up all night preparing for the early flight. "I had to stay up all night because I had to prepare alone." He was screaming. "I'm sorry, but I have a fever." My voice was hoarse from the flu. The fever showed no signs of subsiding. I was coughing. My body ached so much I couldn't get out of bed. Even though I got medicine from the doctor yesterday, I felt worse than the day before. You're really good at pretending to be sick, he spat. It's not an act. I really have a fever, I said in a raspy voice. Then, in the kitchen, my husband turned the faucet on full blast. The noise was loud. He quickly filled a bucket with water, and then, if you have a fever, you should cool down, right? He threw the cold water over me, still in bed. What? I was too stunned to respond. Water dripped down my hair, pajamas, the bed, and onto the floor. Puddles formed on the floor, and the dripping water made noise as it hit them. The area was soaked. The wet blanket made an uncomfortable noise. Cool your head with that. Maybe it'll help you think straight. He sneered at me, picked up his suitcase. Make sure everything is clean by the time I get back. Both the house and your head. Cool it down and reflect. My husband laughed and left the door open as he walked out. The commotion woke up my daughter. Mom? Seeing the soaked floor in bed and me, she cried out in shock and ran over. What is this? She quickly brought a towel and started wiping me and the floor. Shivering from the fever, the cold and the shock of the water, my teeth chattered. In between the chattering, I stuttered out words. He said we had planned this for a long time. To cool my fever in my head, and to clean the house in my head by the time he gets back. That's terrible. My daughter wrapped me in the towel, but as she did, tears welled up in her eyes, and her hands trembled. Wrapped in the towel, I thought to myself, this trip was meant to be a way for my husband to use up his paid leave before retirement. I had planned to do something when my husband retired, but now I'll just do it right away, just a little ahead of schedule, that's all. I'll clean up all right, I murmured. 3 weeks later, my husband returned, and precisely at the time he was expected to arrive home, the phone rang. I anticipated this, so I answered. Hey, where the hell are you? His voice boomed so loudly, I wanted to move the receiver away. I calmly replied, in a tone contrasting his. I'm at my parents' house with Abigail. Why are you so calm? He bit back, his tone escalating, and then, why has it come to this? His voice cracked and fizzled out. It was as if he was at a loss for words. This has come to this? He couldn't continue. I cleaned up, like you said. I spoke the words he couldn't. You mean to tell me you didn't want it this clean? But it's the ultimate clean, isn't it? I cleared it out for you, nice and clean, down to the bare land. Where our house once stood, there should now be just open land. Our house, where is it? My husband alternated between speechless gasps and rapid-fire questions. Understandably so, given the rare and swift nature of what he was seeing. I explained. I hadn't expected my husband to cool down or understand. After all, that land belonged to my parents, and I owned it, right? You're the one who said when building the house, it's your parents' land, so the house should be in your name. So, I decided to demolish it. It's going to be a parking lot now. That kind of reasoning? Before he could finish his thought of, that doesn't make sense. Well, Abigail and I are at my parents', so let's talk there, I said and hung up. My husband arrived, dragging his suitcase. He naturally had to bring it, as there was nowhere else to put his luggage. Given the situation, the in-laws also came along. Thanks to that, the living room was cramped with me, my daughter, my parents, the in-laws, my husband, and 3 suitcases. As soon as he arrived at our house, my husband, without even greeting my parents, I'm exhausted from returning from Italy, and this is what I come back to? Is this some kind of spiteful act? Even if it is, this is going too far. He ranted and raved with great noise and fury, and then, take this. He threw a piece of cheese at me, probably thinking it was a souvenir. Did you see all that? I asked the in-laws, who had witnessed the entire scene. My husband didn't realize his actions were wrong, having become too commonplace. We saw everything, was all the in-laws could say. But my husband, oblivious to his behavior, threw more accusations.
What? What did you see?
It's unbelievable. I had to tell him. What you just did counts as causing emotional distress.
Huh? Which part? Which action? We're family, for God's sake.
Even in a family, there are right and wrong things to do. Take this. That's not something you do to anyone, right? Let alone to family. You've done this to strangers before. My daughter chimed in. Then, turning to the in-laws. Grandma, Grandpa, please help. She played an audio file on her mobile phone. The in-laws listened. By the end, their expressions had turned to, "We must help our granddaughter." The recording started with my husband's voice.
Why isn't there any toothpaste?
Then the sound of something being thrown. Ouch! My scream.
Don't say it hurts just because of a tissue box. I'm busy in the morning. How could you run out of toothpaste?
That was the end of the recording. My daughter tapped another audio file. Then,
"There's no dress shirt laid out."
My husband's angry shout followed by a noise.
"An orange will leave a bruise. You expect me to go to the dresser for a shirt in this rush?"
She then switched from the audio file to a photo on her mobile phone. This photo is from the morning of the trip. It showed me drenched, the flooded floor, and a tipped-over bucket.
Good heavens!
Having listened and seen the photo, the in-laws were speechless. Madison was down with the flu, had a high fever. And at such a time, this child? Mary's voice trembled. I explained to the in-laws while looking at the photo. This was one morning when my fever wouldn't subside. Robert threw a bucket of cold water on me to cool me down. That's outrageous. The in-laws could only shriek. Amidst this, a voice of surprise, but for a different reason, rose. It was my husband.
What?
He clearly hadn't expected to be recorded. The shock was evident in his voice. My daughter said, I was so scared. I started recording because of how afraid I was. Clutching her mobile phone, her voice quivered. I'm so sorry. We didn't realize it had come to this, Mary said, shaking as she tried to embrace my daughter. I continued. That's why, seeing the escalation of my husband's everyday behavior, my daughter began to avoid him, and his anger at being avoided. I had been considering divorce upon his retirement.
What?
My husband's face showed shock.
Divorce?
He clearly hadn't anticipated this. Flustered, the man who had been so vociferous and assertive until a moment ago now clung desperately, wondering where all that bravado had gone.
But I never showed any sign of that. And if what I said and did was so hard on you, you should have just told me.
He started. The nerve of him to say, just tell me. I responded, I have told you repeatedly that it's not worth getting angry over and that it ruins the mood every time. But you never stopped, did you? I quietly let out all the frustrations I had been holding back, but he persisted.
If you had told me more forcefully.
I sighed. It's always the same. When the victim finally snaps, the perpetrator often doesn't realize they were causing harm. This was a classic example. I decided to take this opportunity to tell my parents and the in-laws about everything he had done to others, including his behavior while driving and shouting at supermarket cashiers. He would deny it, saying, Did I really say that? I didn't. But each time, I was there, I heard it, my daughter would counter. It seemed he either didn't remember or minimized his actions, feeling relieved after shouting. Listening to all this, I realized that people who shout in supermarkets probably forget what they said afterward.
And even so, to hold on to such trivial things I don't even remember, to go as far as leveling the house over it?
He tried to return to the topic. I could understand the visual impact of seeing the house reduced to rubble was shocking. But Mary angrily and sadly retorted, All that pent-up frustration exploded because of what you made her endure.
How can you call it trivial?"
His bluster deflated with her words. As for me, I was steadily preparing for the retirement in 2 months. It just happened sooner because of the circumstances, I explained. Mom added, "We had already discussed it. We were prepared for Madison to move in with us if they separated. We had heard all the stories and thought divorce was inevitable, and we wanted to evacuate our granddaughter as soon as possible." This confirmed that my intentions had been known for some time. Mary continued, "You may think it's trivial, but this is a grave sin. The feelings Abigail had while recording and taking photos on her mobile phone. The feelings Madison had while reducing the house to rubble. Just imagining their hearts, and resolve makes mine feel like it's going to burst. Don't you have the imagination to understand that? Can't you put yourself in someone else's shoes? I apologize, not expecting forgiveness, but with the meaning of 'I'm sorry, I won't do it again,' not just 'I'm sorry, please forgive me.'" She shouted and slapped my husband on the back. Then she knelt on the ground before my husband did. John also knelt down and said,
"I'm truly sorry. My son has been incredibly rude."
John pushed my husband's head down, and he apologized. But still,
"I won't divorce. Don't decide that on your own,"
he stubbornly said. "You really are unbelievable." Mary slapped his back while crying.
"Even after hearing that audio, you still don't want to leave. You really must have a heart of a demon."
Hearing this, I thought maybe over the years a demon had indeed taken residence in my husband's heart. I even contemplated if demolishing the house might have exorcised that demon. I decided to sprinkle salt on the parking lot that replaced our home. Eventually, we settled for a mediated divorce. The audio recordings my daughter had made served as evidence of the mental anguish I had suffered regularly, and I was awarded alimony in the divorce settlement. My daughter and I stayed with Mom and Dad for a while before renting an apartment. I continued working at the life insurance company. Now freed from the uncertainty of what might trigger an outburst, I began to enjoy peaceful mornings, realizing how much stress I had been under. The site of our old house became a parking lot, providing a steady income, which helped me save a little for my daughter's wedding fund. Mary and John were furious and refused to let my husband into their house. They wanted to protect their granddaughter. Mary and John told him,
"Don't come near our granddaughter. Leave this town."
So he moved away. I wasn't concerned about his financial woes following his retirement and losing the alimony. Years later, my daughter got married. Mary, John, and both sets of grandparents attended the wedding. Thanks to everyone's protection, I was able to have this wedding. My daughter looked so happy, surrounded by Mary, John, my parents, and me. I framed a photo of the 6 of us from the wedding and displayed it proudly.